So we were wondering what the best way to celebrate Nina's birthday would be, and we decided it would be by having you join us to celebrate Mariano's 150th together.
Well, I'm nearly there.
You've got a long way to go. But we are very, very delighted to be joined by world-renowned designer Nina Campbell, coming to us from London, and Wendy Ligon Smith, who's a professor, a writer, an expert on Fortuny, Proust, and Wagner. Which one's your favorite, Wendy?
Ooh, they're all really interesting. I'm not sure I'd want to hang out with anybody. I wouldn't want to hang out with Wagner as much as I would want to spend time with Fortuny.
Gotcha. And Nina, with you, one of the very first big orders that I was working on, probably about 20 years ago, maybe a little more now, at the factory in Venice, was an order for Harry's in London, when you guys were doing a big refresh over there.
Well, there was an event that happened just shortly before that, because I was in Venice with Mark Burley, and we came to visit for the Fortuny factory, and we met Countess Gozzi and had as much of a tour as you're allowed of the factory, which isn't an enormous amount because it's all so secret, which makes it so special. But she did say that it was, baked so many times and all this, it was rather like alchemy. I think it is alchemy, actually. And we had the most wonderful time. We sat in the garden of the palazzo and had tea. And then I was so fascinated as well by the clothes that I probably was rather gauche, because I said to her, may I see some of the clothes? And she kind of snapped her fingers, and off came this, went this lady, and she came back with all these dresses knotted and tied up and pushed into stockings. And she explained that this is how these dresses were kept, so that the pleats would stay. And I sort of felt that I'd asked to see into somebody's kind of lingerie cupboard or something. So I was rather confused and embarrassed, but she was very sweet. We had the most wonderful time. And it was just amazing to meet her, actually, and sort of be one step nearer to Fortuny himself.
She was quite a remarkable person. I remember meeting her for the first time, and just how I was a kid at the time, and me and my brother and my sister, we were 12, 10, and 8 at the time. So she was quite intimidating to us the first time we met her. Sweet and nice.
Well, I mean, was it your father, therefore, that worked with her?
Yes.
Because
so
we used to ring up quite often, and we used to get him on and he had a sort of slightly higher voice, and she had a very deep voice, and whatever you said, it was the wrong person. If you said, is that Countess Gozzi, your father said, no, it was him. And if you thought, this must be her, and you say, so you always got it wrong. I hadn't realized that was your father. That's lovely. So I did talk to him on the telephone, not that he'd have ever remembered. But
there you go. So why, here we are celebrating his birthday 150 years after his birth, and it's the question that was asked to me is why now? Why does Fortuny still matter? 150 years after his birth, over 70 years since his death. Why are there so many luminaries in the worlds of interiors and fashion and culture and the arts? Why are they still finding so much inspiration in him today? So I was wondering, maybe Nina, you could tell us a little bit from the design point of view what you think about that, and then I'd like to circle back and get get Wendy's perspective on some of this.
Well, I think what I think is interesting about the fabric is that actually it's two things. First of all, it's cotton, which is a very honest and, let's say, ordinary, honest piece of fabric, and yet it's printed with these many, many times, and sometimes with golds and colors that are sort of blended. So it has, it at the same time has the sort of qualities of the most exotic fabric, and yet it's on cotton. So it's not ever going to be a sort of vulgar brocade, which you might come in or out of fashion, it's got it. So that's one of the things which I think is so magical about it. I love to put it on walls, which you'll like to hear because it means you have masses of it. And I put it on furniture where it survived for years, probably because it's so printed, it's so heavily printed. And I think that what has been clever about the people like you that now continue Fortuny is that you're bringing out incredible colors. I mean, I've just done a bedroom in apple green. Now, this may not have been one of Mariano Fortuny's first colors when he was doing it, because I think he really worked much more with the Venetians. So it was the reds and the golds. I've seen a palazzo in Rome, actually done in brown and gold, which is just ravishing. I've seen the oranges and the corals, but I think now to come out with these bright, wonderful, fresh colors means that, you know, it just shows you can just go on and on.
Well, thank you. It's for us, there is that painterly aspect to the fabrics, you know, and we always say that you go into the finest museums in the world, the most amazing works of art are done on canvas, you know, so it's really, it's not about this material, which, yes, it might be an ordinary or common material, but it's a very noble one. And
exactly.
we take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. That's what our alchemy is that magic. So speaking about this past, Wendy, what do you think the lasting power has been? You know, like what is it about Fortuny that makes him relevant still? Like what can you tell us about his history and upbringing that still makes him such a captivating figure today?
I think one of the things that serves as an inspiration for a lot of artists and designers today is actually his working methods. So the way that he was constantly referencing imagery from the history of art and even architecture, and kind of reviving those things in his own designs. It's something I've seen a lot of working designers, the young designers that I've talked to, say that they are inspired by. And I know you all have worked with some designers recently who have used his fabrics in their newer collections. And I think, you know, people say that his work is timeless. I actually like to think of it not as much timeless, but like full of time, because he's taken so many different visual pieces and from many different times, from the classical world, from the world of the Renaissance in Italy. He's taken just from so many different time periods and put this kind of visual iconography together. So I like to think of his garments especially as being full of time, and the patterns just being so consciously recalling historic styles. So I think in that way they operate as kind of timeless, because they are continually referencing something steady and something of the past. And then, like I said, his working methods were just so interesting, the way that he was constantly obsessed with studying, you know, the history of art and seeing the ways that he could replicate patterns that he saw and ideas that he saw. And then, of course, I want to circle back to what you all were talking about with the designs being painted on the fabrics and the cottons. And I think that's a really important element in not only, you know, you all were talking about what that does with the quality of the fabric and kind of the originality of the fabric, but I think it also reflects the way that he approached his work. You know, I kind of argue in this book that I've just finished on Fortuny that he approached all of his work as a painter, because that was the first training that he had. He saw himself largely as a painter. He came from this family of illustrious painters, very celebrated painters in Spain. And so he kind of approached fabric design with the eye of a painter. He's always thinking about light and color and surface, and he's thinking about all of these things as he's painting, having these designs painted on the fabrics.
I like that a lot. I never thought of it as being full of time, and that's what makes it timeless. But so since we brought up the idea of timeless here, you know, I was thinking about this yesterday, and I'm you know, fascinated by the passage of time and how it's recorded by people, and you know, how it stretches and changes speed, but never stops. And you know, the idea of art as being something that freezes time, you know, so even though it captures a moment of it, However, we continue to change and grow. So our relationship to the work, even though the work has become static, the work has a life of its own in that we react to it differently as we grow. And so when it comes to achieving the timeless, I'm going to ask to both of you. But first, Wendy, since you started on it, do you think that Fortuny was searching for the timeless? Is that what he was trying to do? You know, was he searching for his father? Was he searching for a new interpretation of the past? You know, like what do you think it was?
I think he was searching for some kind of overarching themes that he could find in a way that would make them timeless. I think that he wanted to elevate what he was doing to the status of, you know, what we consider high art in a way. You know, he was so consistently inspired by artistic finds, like the Delphos gown was inspired by the fact that they discovered the charioteer of Delphos statue in 1896, and then the patterns on the Knossos scarves were inspired by the archaeological discoveries at Crete, and then he's also looking at the older buildings around Venice and the patterns and the ornamental designs on the buildings and copying those in some of his pattern work. And I think in that way, I think this idea of if I can tap into something older and from a variety of different time periods, that I'm making something that kind of will last. We know he was obsessed with this idea of legacy. If you look into his personal archives, there's a ton of unpublished material, but a lot of it has to do with what he thought was going to happen to his legacy and kind of what was going to happen and the ways that he would record his work and his motivations for posterity's sake. So there's a few documents where he's kind of writing his own autobiographical sketches about, this is my life, this is what it's been like, this is who I was influenced by, and this is what I wanted to accomplish. So I think he very consciously had thought of his place in history and his place in the history of art and how it connected to his predecessors. So he was very historically minded. So I think there was a really conscious effort to engage in kind of this kind of timeline of art and see where he fit in.
I love that. And Nina, what about you? Like when you're creating these spaces and environments, are you looking for the timeless in your projects? You know, is being timeless more important than being in the now? Like, does time even factor into what you're thinking about when you're designing a space?
I think you want to be relevant for now. And I think relevance for now can also mean that it can become timeless. And sometimes I look at old pictures of things that I've done in the past, and you would be perfectly happy to sit in them right now, which is what I like. I mean, you might want to, I would say about my work, lampshades and cushions are the shoes and handbag of the interior design world. So you probably need to change those. But if your basics are good, you can keep them. And I think that's very much the same for Fortuny. And I'm interested because I'd love to ask Wendy in a minute, which came first, the fashion or the interior fabrics, because I think that he had a designer's eye, because what interests me with Fortuny, you can have those wonderful big damask like the Medici and all those wonderful great big damask. And then you've got those tiny little small fabrics and then the middle scale. And I worked for John Fowler. I was very lucky. And he always was talking about mixing scale was really important, but you had to be very careful. You never wanted to have middle scale anything, because he hated the word medium. He said it worked with mediocre. So, why would you have it? But large and small work together, and stripes. And one of my favorite Fortuny fabrics is that very simple ticking stripe, with just the gold line going down it. I mean, it's just so useful. So he was obviously, or maybe not, maybe it just happened. But I mean, for me, you can put a Fortuny damask on the wall, you can team it with a smaller one or another larger one for the curtains. You can use them all together. And some of them you use on the back or the front. I mean, you make them your own. And so I think that's why, that you might drop one for a minute. I mean, maybe for the moment, I might think to myself, that great big damask one with the blues and the greens working together on it. It's a little bit heavy for now, but I'm going to use, something else lighter, and I'll come back to that God forbid, if I'm still alive in 20 years' time, I'll be bringing that back. So there's something, that can move on. Some you will leave for a park for a little bit, and some you'll reuse.
So that's actually, you were telling us recently about reusing the fabrics, actually, about how you're repurposing Fortuny from one room into another, and that was question that it reminded me of something that I was reading in Wendy's book, where she was talking about, and Wendy, if you don't mind, I'm just going to quote a little bit here from your book about how workspaces purposely decorated with accumulated objects are saturated with memory, right? They're spaces designed to facilitate historical daydreaming, spaces where the past is invited to interrupt the present, where memory incites work. So, the idea of Fortuny creating this domestic working space that operates like a dreamlike space, that they're actually meant to remember and resurrect the past. Can you talk a little bit about how these memories were used by Fortuny and what his goal was here? Obviously, in light of his father dying at such a young age. But I'd love to hear a little bit about, if you could expand on that a little bit for us.
Sure. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been able to go to the Palazzo in Venice, but so much of it is preserved the way that he had it laid out. And there, the object collection started by his father and added to in times, with his father and his mother, and as their family continued to travel, all of these objects surrounded him and were placed in a very purposeful way. And in fact, Henriette had left a memo saying that the Palazzo should try to keep intact the way that he had organized the space, because this was such of primary importance to him, the way that he had decorated the Palazzo, because he intended that to kind of, like as I said in the book, to provoke his memories, to be a catalyst for work. And it also helped to showcase his designs. So he would take some of the antique fabrics from the collection and showcase them beside some of his own. And in that way, he's showing this connection between the past and the present, what he had designed and what it was inspired by. So I think we see this very purposeful juxtaposition of objects, of historic objects, and then of seeing like what he has done with them and why. And then of course, touching on his father's legacy. So his father did die when he was only 3 years old, but we see a really conscious connection to wanting to preserve the legacy of the father. He helped write a book on his father, and there are all these written works on his father. His father was a very celebrated artist in Spain, and you can see Mariano's handwritten annotations in the margins. He was very particular about what they got right and what they didn't get right. There's some really harsh criticism in some of the margins, "C'est idiot" and things like that. So he was very passionate about his father's legacy. We see some of his father's works, his paintings displayed around the Palazzo. He made painting studies of his father's paintings, so he was in a way kind of learning from his father. He would copy the canvases just the same way that traditionally artists would copy masterworks, which he did also do. He also copied the paintings of his father. And so I think we see a real spirit of his father's legacy there, a purposeful invoking of that memory, the family memory, but also kind of a larger cultural kind of memory of the space that he's in. And the antiques were, mainly from travels in Northern Africa, and then also throughout Italy and Spain.
There's one line you had that I really liked in there about, with this idea of triggering these memories, and how these artifacts or things that were collected by his father served as both a reminder of his absence and his presence at the same time, something that person collected. And so Nina, when you're designing interior spaces, what does it mean for you to trigger a memory versus disrupting the present? Like how do you use memory and nostalgia as a tool when you're designing your spaces?
Well, I try and find out a bit about my client. I mean, in many cases, I know them, so it's easier. And in some cases, if I don't know them, I want to sort of pull out of them something that they, that they would like to have as a memory, or to have as a constant, let's say, in the design. And I think that's very important. And I also think having furniture or objects from your past to come with you is very important. I mean, I don't like this sort of thing, which is actually happens a lot in America, where people just buy a new house and everything is new, because I think that has no soul to it. And I've just done a big house in Maine, and in fact, I said, there's all this furniture that was in the house. Let's look at it. I mean, let's restore it and use it again, maybe not in the same way, but in another way. So I think that brings soul and memory to a house. And I also always ask clients to buy their own artwork, because I think if they go on holiday and find an object or something and bring it back, that's again a memory that they've done something together and brought it back into the home. And I just want to create a beautiful canvas, and sometimes possibly enhance what they bought, maybe. Because sometimes people, you think, oh, I wish they hadn't gone to that shop.
And I think there's a real connection here too with Marcel Proust, and the way he was obsessive about the history of his furniture and reusing his family's furniture. And there are really interesting stories about what he's done with his family's furniture and how he can't bear to get rid of it. And so if you see photographs of his bedroom, it's just completely crammed full of, like, his mother's armoire and this Japanese screen he couldn't get rid of and things like that. It's a total mess. And then of course there's a story, a kind of off-color story, where he can't bear to part with the furniture, so he gives it away to a place he will visit, which is a brothel. So
well, I did, and in fact we got to the end of the house and the end of the budget, and we had one more bedroom to go, and they did produce this sort of a sort of swan type bed, like a bateau lit. And they said it's so embarrassing. It was covered in gold paint. It was really fairly awful. But I said, you know what? Beggars can't be choosers. Let's paint it white. So we painted it white, and we did it all in this blue and white room. It was really pretty. And the funny thing, we all laughed, because when we showed the house, all their friends said, oh my God, it's fabulous. Oh, this is our favorite room. And where did you get that amazing bed? And oh, weren't we lucky? Great aunt somebody left it as a family, so this terrible bed. But give it a coat of paint, it comes into another generation.
There you go. So I want to go a little bit further back to when Fortuny was living in Paris. That's where he spent his formative years. After his father passed away, the young Mariano Fortuny was only 3 at the time, and his mother moved with him and his sister to Paris, where she had her brothers, and that's where he spent his formative years. But during that time, art was becoming so much more modern, and yet Fortuny kept going further back into the past. That's where he, I liken it to him mining the past to reveal the future. And in doing so, he was able to avoid trends, I think, but it was just, I don't understand, like, Wendy, like, how did he keep from getting stuck in the past, and how did he not get caught up, like, let's say in like the Impressionism movement, where his father was clearly, on the forefront of that movement, and was doing Impressionist painting before it even became the next big thing in Paris. So, like, how did he avoid those pitfalls of getting stuck somewhere and being out of date?
That's an interesting question. I have a hunch there may be more biographical writing on this in the archive, but I haven't gotten to it yet. The archive is really just bottomless. But when I think of trying to chart this kind of decision he's made, obviously a conscious decision to not engage quite as much with the present moment and the present artistic trends as so, choosing to engage more so with the past. I trace that decision a little bit more to the move to Venice. So while he was in Paris from ages 3 to 18, he was studying with his uncles, who were all, he had several uncles there. Cecilia's brothers were there painting, and they were very, prominent portrait painters at the time. And I think he saw something in that he just was not interested in as much, being a society painter. I think he had kind of a noble idea of what a painter should be, and he was looking to, really classic ideas of what we, and like classic Enlightenment ideas of what a painter should be. A painter should be like, well-rounded, and noble, and paint things that are, beyond these commissioned society portraits that his family was doing. And then once he moved to Venice, he really adopted his new city and started looking very closely at the Venetian painters. They call it the Cinquecento, from around 1490 to 1600, became a time period he was really, really intrigued by. And so I think that move happened at a really crucial point in his life. So he turned 18, he suddenly became obsessed with Wagner around this time, and then was really shifting his gaze to the past, I think, more so. So a lot of times, I guess what we don't realize is when an artist is looking at how to portray the world of Wagner, they're having to look to the past, because so many of the operas are set in the past. So I think that is another reason his gaze was drawn kind of backwards into history, is because so many of these Wagnerian operas are set in medieval times and things like that. So he's looking to the past just kind of immediately. At that age of 18, I think, is a key point. He also has a few disparaging things to say about the Ballet Russe, even though that doesn't get talked about very much. It's an unpublished note. It's a very short thing, but he talks about how they burn the candle at both ends. They're not, it's not there's no longevity in this style, I think, is what he saw when he was critiquing some of his contemporaries.
Okay. And so Nina, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said he didn't quite get that one right, because there's still good. And everyone could make a mistake. But it's interesting what you say, Wendy, because I think that if you think about it, it's sort of, I mean, there are some patterns of his which are like Aztec designs, and then you've got, as you say, the sort of Cinquecento and that sort of moves at the same time. The Pre-Raphaelites were sort of doing the, and those garments, and he could have dressed for the Wagner operas, really, couldn't he? And so I think all that's really, I'm sitting here with my Fortuny book and looking at, I got this wonderful page of all his colors up, which
oh yeah.
And it's just sort of, I can't stop looking at it while we're talking, because it's so much, you're drawn into it. But I think I think that those designs that he does are, I mean, I remember at the V&A they did an exhibition which was really they took the Greek key pattern, and they took it from the original Greek key pattern right the way up. I mean, it was 20 years ago now. They're right the way up to Wedgwood's coffee cup with the Greek key around it. And every pattern in life has just come through all these various different things, and it ends up, and it's just unique. And in a way, you look at the Fortuny, whether he's got it as a border around a velvet coat for somebody. And I think the other thing that's interesting about, actually, and Mickey, I don't know if you could do this. I mean, I think some of his patterns printed on velvets are just glorious, and I know they're very soft and they fall so beautifully, but I would adore to start decorating and designing and using a velvet Fortuny in.
Well, you're in luck, Nina. We can make that happen for you.
You've got them.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, because I think the richness of the velvet and the softness of again, a cotton velvet, I mean, just would be beautiful. And I think he must have been very sensual, really, because it was all those dresses, when you look at them. I mean, he must have loved the female form, because they were so extraordinary and unique. And, yes, you couldn't, I suppose people have copied them since, but that doesn't matter.
Well, we credit, we like to think of him as being a big part of what liberated the female form in fashion. Yeah. With clothing being so restrictive in the early 1900s, with all the corsets and layers that women were obliged to wear, he created this simple sheath of silk that was to be worn on the woman uncorseted, which was very risque at the time. But I think it was a big step in finally freeing the female form. And
was he afraid? To...
I'm sorry, was he what?
Did he have a friendship with Chanel? Do we know that?
I
I
don't know
haven't
about that.
found any trace of that.
No. I mean, it's interesting because I mean, she with her jersey and him with his,
Yeah,
there's one.
I mean, there's some relationship with Poiré.
Oh, right. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that makes, yeah.
And of course, that unstructured nature of the gowns is why they were so prevalent with dancers like Isadora Duncan. And then the actress Lyda Borelli, she is very famous for her gesturing. There's this magnificent film called Rhapsodia Satanica, and she does all of this gesturing that almost feels like dance. And she's wearing a Delphos gown that clings to her body to kind of exaggerate her movements. It's really lovely.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I've never seen that.
That's an Italian film from, I think, 1907.
Okay. Well, since we're on the subject of his dresses, we do have one of our audience members that was curious, Wendy, about your thoughts and feelings regarding Fortuny's dresses on Albertine and Proust.
Sure. Yeah, that's something I've researched a lot because that's actually how I found my way to Fortuny, is through studying Proust. And it is really interesting to read. I think you all just posted this on your Instagram today too, the Fortuny Instagram. There's a little excerpt from the novel where Proust actually says there's no room for being vague in the description of this gown because it actually exists. And so very often in Proust's novel, he has the room to kind of embellish or exaggerate something about an artist because he makes up these fictional artists. So he has a fictional painter and a fictional writer, and he can kind of make them be what he wants them to be. But he chose to use Fortuny gowns for Albertine because of this connection to Venice that he wanted to build in, and because of, the timelessness that we've been talking about, or, the being full of time, as I like to say. And so because he's referencing an actual gown and a real artist, he had to do real historical digging. So he wrote to Fortuny's aunt, who had, sorry, let me get this right. Yes, it was Fortuny's aunt, who through remarriage was actually, so she's the stepmother to Coco Madrazo, you may have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the second wife of Federico, who was the painting teacher of Fortuny. And she, the stepmother, is also related to Rinaldo Hahn, who was at one point a lover of Marcel Proust. So there's this kind of interconnectedness between the two. And Maria de Madrazo says, let me lend you my book on Carpaccio, because that's someone that Fortuny studied. And if you look at these Carpaccio paintings, you'll be able to understand Fortuny's velvets. And so I think that's just such an interesting connection, the way that even at the time they're saying, he's so steeped in the history of art that if you study the painters he's looked at, you'll be able to understand his work. And she even offered to give him her garments so that he could study the actual garments to write about in the book, especially the volume with Albertine. And he turns her down and chooses to kind of access his knowledge about Fortuny through Carpaccio and through painting instead of through the real actual garments. So he's really wanting to emphasize this connection to the historic Venice. So I think that's why he relies on Carpaccio, because of course the symbolism in the novel is that the Fortuny gowns symbolize this kind of intermingling of love and desire for Venice and for Albertine, and this kind of unmet desire. I don't know how many of you have read much of Proust, but in the very first volume as a child, there are these plans that his family makes to go to Venice, and he's just dying to go to Venice. But then he gets so excited that he makes himself ill, and he gets too sick to be able to actually go. So you wait thousands of pages, and then he finally gets to go later. So there's this symbol of kind of, the Fortuny gowns are a symbol of waiting, is another really interesting thing, because the narrator places an order for Fortuny gowns for Albertine because he knows they will take so long that it will make her stay, because she's like kind of, they're back and forth lovers, and he's worried she's going to leave him. And kind of rightfully so. They have a pretty dysfunctional relationship, but he knows that she will wait for the Fortuny gowns. And he also knows they take a long time to be made and come over to Paris. So they're the symbol of waiting, they're a symbol of Venice, they're a symbol of desire. And that's why I think it was so key for Proust to use Fortuny garments for Albertine.
Fascinating. I have to do a series with you on the book. And
It's fascinating. I can't wait for it to come out.
No, thank you. Yeah, it'll be next year. It's with Yale University Press.
Wait, you're being Proust. You're making us wait.
exactly. So what about the future? My brother and I always thought that Fortuny would be in the first home on Mars. So Nina, if you're putting Fortuny fabric in the first human living environment in space, like what are you, have you considered space luxury as your new niche market? And like,
no, but I'm going to think about that tomorrow, especially as they've been they've been and come back. But I think
crazy.
I would ball out the inside of my pod in Fortuny. And I'm sure if we look far enough into the Fortuny textile archive, we'd find something with moons and stars, and
I think it's all there.
It's all going to be there. So wouldn't that be amazing? But meanwhile, I just think we just need to go on using it and celebrating it, because it's just magical stuff, and we put it on and it just gives you such enormous pleasure, I think. And I think that's what we need.
It's a very, very it's a labor of love producing these fabrics, producing in Venice. And for us, that's always been really the remarkable thing about it is how is to create something inanimate that has a soul, something that to inject an object with a soul and a spirit is really what I feel our alchemy and magic is here. And just continuing this language and expanding on it and embracing his love of technology, his love of the new, while remaining so dedicated to the past. So that's something that we feel very, very honored to be a part of continuing that legacy. Wendy,
I would love to ask you a question, which is,
oh, please.
I'm fascinated by how your father came to Venice and decided to work, or is your family from Venice for centuries?
No, well, actually, my family's actually Egyptian.
Well, that I know, but
I'm the first person in my family born outside of Egypt. I was born here in New York. My parents, my father and mother, both born and raised in Egypt. My family is Coptic. They felt that when they were married in November of 1968, that they weren't going to have as many opportunities for them if they stayed in Egypt. So they sold my mother's wedding ring. My father was 23 at the time. My mother was 19. They sold my mom's wedding ring to have enough money to buy their plane tickets and flew over to the States with a little over $400 in their pockets. And they were headed to Colorado, where my father had an aunt living, but he had a cousin in New York at the time who said, "Why don't you stay with us for a week or two?" And they never left. They had their luggage sent back from Colorado, and my father was very eager to get working. So he started taking classes and got a job to get his CPA. And he wanted to be an attorney. And back then you could do an apprenticeship where you study under an attorney for 3 years to qualify for the bar exam. So he went to a headhunting agency and they sent him to a law firm, and that lawyer hired him on the spot. That lawyer, Mr. Gray, turned out to be the lawyer for Countess Elsie Ligazzi. And this was in 1971 now. And my father was extremely bright, very honest, a lot of integrity, and the lawyer he was studying under made a mistake that infuriated the Countess. And she said, "From now on, Megan is going to handle all my work." So she became his first client at the age of, he was 26. And he was now the lawyer for the Countess. And they had a great working relationship. About 10 years later, this was now 1981 or so, she was getting quite up there in her years and was worried that when she died, the company would be swallowed up by a larger corporation, become exploited, and really lose everything that makes Fortuny so special. So she asked my father to purchase the company from her. And he said, "No, I'm a lawyer in New York. I don't know anything about fabric or art. What am I going to do with a company in Italy? Thank you, but no thank you." And she refused to take no for an answer. And letters went back and forth between the two of them for years. And in 1986, she flew our family out there and she brought my father into the factory. He's the only person she ever brought into the factory that wasn't one of the workers.
Yeah.
Her husband, the Count, who lived there at the property with her, it's literally a 12-second commute from where he was staying to the factory. She never once let him in. She said that he talked too much. But she wanted to convince my father otherwise, and my father continued to resist even after we went. And he told her, as your lawyer, I can't do this. It's just going to send up red flags everywhere. Thank you, but no thank you. I can't. So she went behind his back and found another attorney and drew up the paperwork and finally just put it in front of him and said, just sign. And finally in 1988, he agreed. He didn't even tell us that he had done this for years. And when she passed away in 1994, that's when our family got involved in the day-to-day operations.
I love the fact that your parents sold their wedding ring, because the Fortuny veil had to be pulled through the wedding ring to make sure how fine it was, and that was the sign of this most exquisite Fortuny veil. So I think it's a sort of full circle. So I think it's a wonderful story.
And Fortuny was so interested in Egypt as well. Have you seen all his magnificent travel photographs? I'm sure you have.
I tried for years to get into the Fortuny Museum, and finally we got to know Claudio there, and they let us in, and we were the first exhibition that they were doing at the Fortuny Museum in years of Fortuny's work, because they had rented it out for other exhibitions in the past. But for the first one that they were doing of his work, it was when I was living in Venice at the time, and we did a field trip with the entire staff and the team at the factory. We all went to the museum together, and it was an exhibition of his photos that he had taken while he was in Egypt. And so it was just a nice little sign. And again, back to what Nina was saying, with everything coming full circle.
That's beautiful.
But,
and do you remember, were you part of the exhibition that came to London, to Brighton rather? Because there
the
was
Countess was.
Right.
She was. We actually have an old poster of that exhibition here in New York.
Because I came to that. I think I told you that story. I was invited to that exhibition, and because Princess Michael of Kent opened it.
Oh, can you please share the story with us?
It is quite funny, because Princess Michael is a friend of mine, and she very sweetly rang me up and she said, I've been invited to open the exhibition of Fortuny, and you're obviously one of the people that would love to be there. So will you come with me? So I, of course, agreed rapidly. And the mayor of Brighton sent his old Rolls Royce, very old, huge, very grand Rolls Royce, to London, unfortunately with a very large chauffeur who hadn't been in his uniform for many years and many cakes later. So he was absolutely, could barely move. I mean, he was in this frock-coated sort of uniform, where the buttons came like that. And it would have been wonderful sort of 10 years before, but he could barely drive the car. Anyway, we drove the car. We got in, we looked ridiculous because we were in ball dress, long dresses and jewelry, she in wonderful jewelry, me in my Kenny Lane. And off we set, but looking rather ridiculous at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And unfortunately, the car got a flat tire on the way. And so, of course, we had a detective with us, and he called the police. And unfortunately, we stopped at a bus stop. And obviously, the sensible thing would have been if we'd got out of the car. But we couldn't get out of the car, A, because of who she was, and B, because we were in long dresses and jewelry. And so the poor, sort of rather sweating chauffeur had to pump the car up and change the wheel. And there was a very sensible man who I think had come, he was a little bit sort of challenged, I think, in his speech, but he kept shouting at us, get out of the car. And of course we couldn't, so we felt too stupid anyway, sitting in the back. So finally, we got back in the car. We had police outriders to take us so we wouldn't be late. And of course, this driver went so slowly that every other car in the whole of the world was coming between us and the policeman. So we eventually got to Brighton, and we had this wonderful exhibition. And then we sat down, and the mayor of Brighton opened the exhibition. And very flustered he was, because he didn't know anything about, why he was there, or anything about the exhibition or anything about Fortuny, and he was bamboozled by the whole thing. And he stood up to open the exhibition, and he said, "I would like to invite you, your Royal Highness and your ladies," and all that palaver. And he also had, I don't know if you know about the English mares, they have huge gold chains around their neck with, I mean, they look fantastic and slightly stupid. And so he said, "And I'd like to announce the opening of the Mariano Fortuny exhibition," where at that point, everybody totally collapsed into giggles, and the poor man didn't know what he. But anyway, we then, that was, it was a wonderful exhibition, but it was full of things that made me laugh because it was just so incredibly, well, it was unforgettable on many levels.
Amazing. Now we know the name of our new cannabis line.
It's very fashionable. Maybe you could weave cannabis.
Yes, no, that was really, it's amazing how many stories there are that exist. And to this day, you know, we still have people come in and tell us stories about their first introduction to Fortuny or when they met the Countess. And it's just so nice to be able to sit here today with both of you, and, you know, from completely different worlds, still talking with such reverence about this man that has had such a big influence on our lives and on the world at large. So thank you for being here with us for that.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
So Wendy, Nina, do you guys have any questions that you would like to ask me? Or because I think what we wanted to do was celebrate you and Mariano and just wish him a happy birthday. 150 years. We got very lucky, actually. We thought that this year, for the longest time, there was a plaque that had mentioned 1921 as the year the factory started producing, and we were planning to do an event there to celebrate the 100-year anniversary, and then we luckily discovered that the first fabrics to be produced at the factory were produced in 1922. So we got an extra year for the planning. So I hope that next year we'll be able to have this conversation in person in Venice, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the factory.
Well, I'm very grateful to COVID because I was 75 last year, but because I didn't really have what I consider a birthday, I'm only 75 this year. So you've got to look on the bright side of everything that happens.
Absolutely.
This is my cake for my 75th.
There it is. Happy birthday.
There it is. Thank you for sending it.
We made a special one here for Mariano.
We have to see this one. It's going to be magical.
Thank you. I'm just trying not to drop it before I. So
oh God, isn't it beautiful?
Go. And this is one of the smaller archival prints that you were talking about. This one we called Favo. A wish.
Beautiful.
Here. Wow.
So happy birthday, Mariano. Thank you for all that you've done and all that you've given the world. I'm not going to blow this out because it's COVID and we don't blow on candles anymore. But I will just wave at it and it will go out.
Yeah, we've got.
I still made a wish though.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to say happy birthday,
Happy
Mariano.
birthday.
Thank you, and happy birthday again, Nina. Thank you so much. Thank you, Wendy, so much. And I look forward to speaking with you both and to seeing you both, hopefully in person very soon.
Definitely, I'll be there. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for
All right.
having us.
Much love.
Bye. Much love to you.
Bye.